I can't take this anymore. Please say something too. I had reached my limit and couldn't hold back my frustration any longer. What are you talking about all of a sudden? This isn't sudden. I've asked you about this so many times. You need to tell your brother to leave. I confronted my husband Daniel, telling him to ask his younger brother, Ryan, to move out of our house. You want me to kick my own brother out when he has nowhere else to go? How can you even say that? You're my wife, and he's your brother-in-law. Exactly, you're so heartless. It wasn't just Daniel. I was also being scolded by my mother-in-law, Margaret, as if I was the one doing something wrong. This is my story about dealing with an unbelievable family. My name is Sarah. I married my husband Daniel when I was 28 years old. We met through an arranged introduction. Back when I was a student, I was completely focused on playing tennis, a sport I had loved since childhood. Because of that, I never got involved in any romantic relationships. Between my tennis practices and my studies, I was always too busy to date. It's not like I never wanted to get married, but since I had no experience in relationships, I had no idea how to start one. Even after I began working, I still couldn't find a boyfriend. My boss noticed this and introduced me to Daniel, saying he was a good man. When I first met him, he seemed kind and soft-spoken. He worked for the government and had a calm and peaceful personality. Since he liked me and I had always wanted to get married before turning 30, I quickly agreed to start dating him. We got along well, and before long, we genuinely fell in love. I especially liked how sincere and kind he was, and I thought I could really marry this man. Eventually, he proposed, and without hesitation, I said yes. Everything went smoothly, and we got married. When we decided to get married, my parents, who were well off and owned several vacation homes, offered to give us one. They let me choose, so I picked a house that wasn't too big or too small, just right for starting a family. The house had extra space for a future child, a nice garden, and was in a great location near a bus stop and shops. Daniel, who rarely showed excitement, said with disbelief, "Wow, are you sure we can really have such a nice house?" At that moment, I truly believed we were about to start a happy life together. After our wedding, everything was going well. But just a few months later, Daniel's father, who had been sick for a long time, passed away. Daniel had a younger brother, Ryan, who worked in another state, so we didn't see him often. In fact, I had only met him twice, once at our wedding and again at the funeral. With his father gone, Daniel's mother, Margaret, was now living alone. Daniel started calling her more often, and soon she began visiting our house almost every day. Since Daniel was the oldest son, I understood why he felt responsible for her. But at the time, I was busy with work, and home was my only place to relax. Coming back to find Margaret there all the time started to bother me. This continued for a few months, and then one day, Daniel brought up an idea. "Hey Sarah, I'm thinking about having Mom move in with us." "What?" I was completely caught off guard. "What are you talking about? She's already here almost every day," I said. He responded, "But isn't it tiring for her to keep coming back and forth? Wouldn't it be easier if we all just lived together?" He said it with a bright, hopeful expression, like he had just come up with the perfect solution. "Hold on, you can't just decide something like that without talking to me. We have our own life and routine here." I tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. "This house is way too big for just the two of us. We have plenty of space, and living together would really help Mom." It was clear that, no matter what I said, he had already made up his mind. I never gave Daniel a clear answer, but he kept bringing it up. Anytime something happened, he would say, "I'm worried about leaving Mom alone." Honestly, I wasn't comfortable with the idea, partly because we had just started our married life. But every time Daniel said he was worried about Margaret, I didn't know how to argue against him. While I kept avoiding a definite answer, Margaret went ahead and sold her house. I had no choice but to accept her moving in with us. At first, I was upset with Daniel for making decisions without my agreement, but when he said, "My parents' house is gone now, and Mom has nowhere else to go, so we have no choice," I lost the will to argue. After that, life became really difficult for me. Margaret didn't bully me, but she constantly reminded me of my role. "You're his wife, right?" she would say over the smallest things. "You married my son, so you should serve your husband's family," she'd remind me. She had very old-fashioned views, and whenever I prioritized my work, she would say, "You're my daughter-in-law, so you need to act like one." Since Margaret moved in, I started staying at the office longer to avoid being at home. Life continued this way, me dodging Margaret's remarks, until something even worse happened. A while later, Daniel's younger brother, Ryan, who had been working in another state, suddenly announced he was quitting his job at the end of the year and coming back home. Daniel, Margaret, and I were all surprised by his sudden decision, but the biggest problem was, where would he live? Their family home had already been sold, so he had nowhere to return to. When Ryan arrived, he was furious that no one had told him about the house being sold. "Are you kidding me? No one told me about this. What the hell were you thinking?" he shouted. Ryan had a rough personality. He used to be involved with a bad crowd, and his flashy clothes and aggressive attitude always made me uneasy. "I'm sorry," Daniel said hesitantly, "but I was worried about Mom being alone. I thought you were going to stay at your job for a long time." Ryan scoffed. "Oh, really? And you just decided that all on your own? You better take responsibility for this." Even though Daniel was the older brother, he completely froze under Ryan's anger. Before he passed away, their father had left everything in Margaret's hands. Ryan had left home years ago without helping his family in any way, so he had no right to be mad. That's what I thought, but in the end, we couldn't reach an agreement. Ryan ended up moving in with us under the condition that he would stay until he found a new job. I was completely against it. I can't have Ryan living here too. We're already struggling with expenses now that Margaret is here. I complained to Daniel, but he told me that Ryan would leave as soon as he found a job, so I had to put up with it until then. I couldn't just tell Ryan to move out on my own, so I had no choice but to let him stay for now. At this point, I was already exhausted, but the real struggle started after that. First, Ryan didn't even try to find a job. A whole month passed, and he hadn't looked at job listings, gone to interviews, or made any effort at all. He just spent his days lying around in the living room. Some days, he would stay in his room blasting loud music. Other days, he would sit in front of the TV for hours while I got more and more frustrated. To make things worse, as soon as I got home from work, he would say things like, "Where's my dinner?" Or, "I'm taking a bath first, so get it ready." I couldn't take it anymore and complained to Daniel. "Hey, can you do something about Ryan's attitude? He treats me like a maid." Daniel just laughed and said, "What do you mean? He thinks of you like a sister and really cares about you in his own way." "Cares about me? No way. He orders me around. This is exactly like being a maid. I'm not a servant in this house." Seeing how upset I was, Daniel just sighed. "Come on, Sarah. You're my wife after all. You'll be fine." That was the last straw for me. "Yeah, I'm your wife, not his," I yelled. "Don't make such a big deal out of this," Daniel said. "You're right. You're not his wife, but he is like your little brother. Just try to get along with him." I couldn't believe it. Daniel really thought that as long as I was the only one suffering, everything would be fine. At that moment, I realized there was no point in arguing with him anymore. I stopped complaining about Ryan and Margaret after that. Instead, I would call my parents sometimes and vent to them. My mom and dad told me I could always come home if things got too bad, and that gave me the strength to keep going. But then Ryan caused another disaster. One day, I came home from work and saw a fire truck parked in front of our house. My heart dropped. As I stood there in shock, I saw several firefighters walking out of our house. Daniel and Margaret stood at the door, bowing and thanking them. After the fire trucks left, I rushed up to Daniel. "What happened? Why were firefighters here?" Daniel and Margaret exchanged awkward looks before Daniel finally spoke. "Well, Ryan was smoking, and his cigarette butt started a fire." "What?" I shouted, furious. When I asked for more details, they told me that Ryan's cigarette had started a small fire. But Margaret quickly called Daniel and the fire department. I couldn't understand why they didn't contact me. It was a good thing I came home when I did, just as the firefighters were leaving. But if I hadn't come home, would they have kept it a secret? I asked them, but they stayed silent. I was so frustrated, I stormed into Ryan's room without knocking. "Hey, you should knock before coming in," Ryan yelled. I ignored him and looked around the room. I immediately saw the burn marks on the floor right next to his bed. The house had smelled like cigarettes ever since Ryan moved in, and it was stressing me out. Now there were burn marks in my beloved home. I was at my breaking point. I didn't care that Margaret and Ryan were there. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I've had enough of this. Please say something too. Daniel, confused, asked, "What do you mean all of a sudden?" "This isn't sudden. I've been telling you for a while now. You need to say something to your brother." I confronted Daniel, demanding that he ask Ryan to leave our house. Daniel sighed and said tiredly, "You want me to kick my brother out with nowhere to go? How can you say that when you're his sister-in-law?" "That's right. You're the worst," Margaret added. Not just Daniel, but even Margaret started blaming me. Why was I being blamed? This was my home. My father gave it to me. Margaret and Ryan had moved in without my permission, and now they were acting like I was the problem. I couldn't back down, so I told Ryan directly, "I want you to leave." "How could you? Are you seriously saying you want to kick your brother-in-law out?" Ryan shouted, then stormed out of the room. He had a smirk on his face as he left. I was so frustrated that I went to my room. The next day, when I got home from work, the key wouldn't fit into the door. I tried and tried, but it wouldn't work. When I rang the doorbell, no one answered. Then my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "I changed the locks. I'll let you back in after you cool down." Unbelievable. I thought, if they were going to treat me like this, I'd leave. I went straight to my parents' house and explained everything. My parents listened carefully, and my dad's face became serious. "Leave the rest to me," he said. He immediately hired a lawyer he knew. Things moved quickly after that. I sent Daniel a letter demanding alimony and divorce, as well as a certified letter telling them to leave the house. At first, Daniel refused the divorce. Divorce over something like this? It's ridiculous. But when I threatened to take him to court, he suddenly stopped arguing. When we discussed him moving out, he raised his voice again. "This house is mine too. As your husband, I have rights to it." The lawyer pulled out the registration papers. "You don't have any rights to this house." Daniel, Margaret, and Ryan went pale. They had never expected this. Daniel begged, "Please reconsider, Sarah." But I stood firm. "I won't change my mind. I'm getting a divorce." Eventually, Daniel, Margaret, and Ryan moved out. Daniel struggled to pay the alimony, and they ended up in a small, run-down apartment. Ryan got into trouble later on for attacking someone, but that wasn't my concern anymore. I got my house back, fixed everything, and now my parents come to visit on the weekends. I'm finally living happily.